Welcome back. We're looking at politics and the interconnections between those who run policy. Do they have actually more power than those elected officials? Joining me is Janine Waddell, author of Shadow Elite, How the World's New Power Brokers Undermine Democracy, Government and the Free Market, and Michael Lind, Policy Director of the New America Foundation's Economic Growth Program. And actually, Michael Lind, back to you with a question from one of our viewers. This one came from Pakistan, sent to our Facebook page. Rizwan says, the more money a certain lobby spends, the more favourable the policy that comes into force. The president and all the other government functionaries are puppets in the hands of these lobbyists. How much is this shadow elite that Dr. Waddell talks about a function of the lobbyists? Is it the lobbyists that that drive the creation of the shadow elite?
Oh, I think if you read the book, The Shadow Elite, which I recommend, you'll see that it's not a conspiracy theory in which there are puppets and puppet masters, but it's a very good both sociological and anthropological description of actual power networks and issue networks. So I think you don't want to get the idea that we're talking about some sort of conspiracy theory. It's simply factions within the elite, which you have in one form or another everywhere.
I'll put a couple of questions to you back to back, Dr. Waddell. These came from a couple of viewers. The first one's from Liverpool in the UK, where Abdul Ismail wrote in saying, the Iraq war was primarily due to Bush wanting revenge, Cheney wanting profit, and the neocons wanting to assist Israel. I'm not sure war profiteers were involved in the decision to invade Iraq. And the second one related to this is from Washington here in the USA, where Kenneth writes in saying, there is an obvious linkage of the characters behind Iran-Contra, the second Iraq war, and the possible coming hostilities against Iran. Why is this not more well known? Now, you write a lot about the connections of those who pushed for the US invasion of Iraq, and you say that many of them were the same players who were involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. How have they managed to survive and resurface so intact?
Well, I think really it's important to make clear that there are really two major players in Iran-Contra who were involved in what I call the neocon core. And there are two things about that Iran-Contra experience that are important, not just those two players, and that they train themselves in these ways of doing business, which are, again, not at all conspiratorial. It is about people working within and outside of government and bypassing the bureaucratic structures as much as possible, setting up their own and working directly with the executive, which they did very clearly in Iran-Contra. They went to Ronald Reagan. And so it was also not just those players, but the modus operandi that I think got perfected over the years with the neocon core. And again, it's not at all a conspiracy. It's people working. What I would add to what Michael Lind just said is that it's people working in and outside of the bureaucracy. And again, they're personalizing the bureaucracy, and they're getting information and they're branding it their own information, their own versions as the most official. So it's a very clear-eyed view of how things took place, and they had a role in it. They didn't play the only role, but they played a key role in taking the United States to war.
Michael, why isn't there legislation to protect this? I know there are certain rules. For example, those in the military are supposed to wait a year or so, like a cooling off period, before they get back into any kind of deal with the military. But there are so many cases where you have former generals and former top officials from the military becoming senior mentors is the term they use often, or being advisors, or being essentially contractors to the military. Why isn't there something that legislates to stop the blurring of the lines?
Well, because both parties have their shadow elites. There are Democrats as well as Republicans who benefit from this. Both parties have an enormous number of so-called in and outers who come in and out of government, and when their party's not in power, they stay in think tanks, or they're in private business or in lobbies. So there's simply not a political constituency for changing the system.
Dr. Waddell, there's a viewer who wrote in from Texas, Kayla, and I want to put this to you. It says, your book briefly mentions that Iran is the next target of the Flexians who brought us the Iraq war. Can you say more about what they are doing and how they are using Flexian and FlexNet thinking and actions to promote their goals?
Well, yes. I mean, this particular group, the neocon core, has been really they've been very invested in what is called regime change in Iran, and that's one of their goals. And they're basically using the same kinds of methods that I that I outlined earlier to do that. I mean, as much as they can in an Obama administration.
It's interesting, Michael. This is a comment from a viewer in Turkey. If I could put this to you, Sinan Çetinkaya says, "The people who govern the U.S. are the same people who run the Federal Reserve, media, and financial system. They are more powerful than governors. That is why politicians change, but policies never change." Does that mean there's no accountability, essentially, for anyone who sets a policy?
No, I think it's very difficult in the United States to identify accountability, partly because of this kind of shadow government system, but partly because power is so diffuse and decentralized and there's so many veto points in it. But I would disagree with any idea that there's a single all-powerful elite behind the scenes. In fact, there's fairly dramatic rivalry at the top level that's not always captured by the left-right divide, but it's by no means monolithic.
And yet there's a commander-in-chief, and I want to put an email that came from a viewer from our Facebook page, El Bariki Kilewo, writes in saying, "The US has a certain platform towards Israel that Obama cannot change, even if he wants to. That's what's happening with his foreign policy in the Iran confrontation." So based on this idea, how much real power does the president have?
Well, I think the president is the commander-in-chief ultimately. You have a great deal of infighting going on around and beneath him. You saw this in the change of the Bush administration's policy after 2006, when you had the so-called realists, like Secretary of Defense Gates, reasserted themselves. There's some reports that they restrained Israel during that 2-year period, and the neoconservatives were defeated in that later era of the Bush administration. But what's particularly interesting and what illustrates Dr. Waddell's point is that in the Bush years, you see a struggle between the Flexians, or the in and outers, who were largely political appointees, and the permanent government foreign service officials, the diplomats and the Defense Department. And that doesn't fit into the ordinary kinds of political struggles we think about. You find analogies in other countries, though, where the permanent government, the civil service and the military, do sometimes thwart initiatives by the political branch.
Well, Dr. Waddell, interestingly enough, we've talked about how this power network exists within the US. Is it a network that has a strong international connection? Is it one that has its tendrils out there across the globe that also helps to serve to lock these people into such a strong power base?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's not just one network. There are many networks, and there are competing networks, as Michael Lind pointed out. And in fact, that is the primary means of accountability, if you were, the competition between and among elite networks. But one of the things that distinguishes these influencers from those of the past is that they are global in reach, and they're very peripatetic. They're less visible. I mean, even though they brand themselves, they're less. It's less easy to know exactly who they are at any given moment. They're less visible and they're less stable. But there are many networks and many players of all political stripes, and that's a key point to remember. We've been talking about sort of one political stripe, but it's on the right, it's on the left. They can't be reduced to any faction.
Michael, in what parallels to these kinds of networks that exist in the US that certainly have been guiding the policies here, do you see elsewhere, and how strong are they in setting policy? Presumably the US, because it leads in so many ways, has the final say in many cases.
Well, there's been a parallel some have drawn in terms of our financial sector having the kind of influence that you find in countries with so-called oligarchies, whether in Latin America or Russia. I think the key point is not whether a country is developed or not, it's whether it has a weak government or a weak state or not. And in that sense, the US does have a state that is so weak and that is so open to penetration by private interests at so many points that in some ways it really is more like Russia or Mexico than it is like Britain or France or Germany.
It's interesting. I want to just, with less than a minute to go, Dr. Waddell, recount your conversation with senior advisor to then President Bush, where the advisor chastised those living in the reality-based community, arguing it wasn't how the world worked, and added that the US was an empire and could create its own reality. What sort of alarm bells did that ring? Just a brief thought.
Well, I mean, if we can create our own reality, then where is our democracy? Doesn't that have a real bearing on whether we can continue to have a democracy?
I mean, do you feel democracy is in threat purely because of this?
I think whether we can act, whether the government can act in the national and public interest is at stake and is the issue here.
All right. Well, Dr. Janine Waddell and Michael Lind, thank you very much for discussing this particularly intriguing topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. Be sure to tweet us your questions and comments so that we can include them on the show. On the next program, the continued fighting between the military and rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo is raising questions about the UN mandate there. Human rights groups accuse the Congolese army of killing hundreds of innocent civilians in its ongoing operations in the eastern part of the country. Send us your questions and thoughts for that, and be sure to tune in. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.